They call you weird because they have no language for your depth. That's how shallow minds cope. They reduce what they can't label. They watch you operate outside their code, and instead of learning the syntax, they mock it. They can't imagine a world where someone exists without craving the same validations they do. Your silence feels threatening, your focus unnatural, your curiosity invasive. And so they label you odd, off, eccentric, as if those words hold power. But you know the truth. What they call weird is uncompromised originality. What they mistake for misfit energy is just unfiltered alignment. And the most remarkable people in history were ridiculed for the same thing. They simply refused to dilute their design to fit inside a lesser system. You didn't ask to stand out. You just refused to disappear. You weren't trying to be different. You were trying to be real. But authenticity in a performative world is always seen as rebellion. You wore your thoughts like armor, your solitude like silk, and your imagination like it was oxygen. They laughed not because they understood, but because they didn't. People only mock what makes them nervous. You made them nervous. You walked into rooms without adjusting your frequency. You asked questions that shook their facades. You stayed in your lane while they swerved for approval. And that scared them. Because your refusal to assimilate whispered a threat to their conformity. You don't need the tribe to thrive. You didn't fold when they called you too intense. You sharpened. You didn't shrink when they said you were too much. You became precise. They watched you from the corner of their eye, waiting for the cracks. But the cracks never came. Because you weren't pretending, they were. You didn't need to maintain an illusion. You are the real, and the real never requires repair. What they call weird now will one day be called visionary. That's how the cycle works. First they mock it, then they fear it, then they study it, then they try to replicate what you were born with. But replication can't touch origin, and you were never a replica. You were always the blueprint. They misunderstand your energy because it's not designed to be consumed. You don't radiate for applause, you glow from alignment. Your frequency isn't tuned for entertainment, it's tuned for evolution. And people stuck in loops of image worship will never understand those who operate from internal truth. You feel too much, think too long, care too deeply. They say it like it's a flaw, but you know it's your compass. You walk through the world with a radar they don't even know exists. You sense motives, feel shifts, decode silences. That's not weird. That's elite perception. But elite perception always looks insane to those who operate off instinct alone. They wanted you to need them, to doubt yourself enough to seek their approval. That's how conformity sustains itself, by starving the remarkable of recognition until they fold. But you didn't. You made peace with being misunderstood. You made solitude sacred. You let the laughter echo, but you never let it touch the root. Because you knew. You knew your wiring was intentional, that the things they teased would one day be the very reasons you'd rise. The way you analyze everything, the way you feel without filters, the way you speak in metaphors and move in silence. These traits they mocked are the same ones they'll crave when their reality finally cracks. You scare them because you weren't built to chase. You attract not by effort, but by alignment. And that magnetism? It's unsettling to people who need a crowd to feel seen. They called you weird because you didn't perform, because you didn't laugh on cue, because you didn't dilute your intensity to match their casual. You came into the world with high-definition vision, and they mistook it for delusion. But now they're squinting in your direction, trying to read the signs they once ignored, because even the blind can feel when a light refuses to dim. What they call weirdness is really freedom. You don't shapeshift to belong. You don't negotiate your curiosity to fit their tempo. You stay rooted in the strange, in the misunderstood, in the unscripted beauty of your own mind. And that makes you unpredictable, dangerous, remarkable. Because while they practiced the art of fitting in, you mastered the science of becoming. You didn't wait to be validated. You validated yourself with every action, every boundary, every idea you protected when they tried to reduce it to nonsense. Your weirdness is not a flaw, it's a flag planted in uncharted terrain. Your terrain. They don't know how to engage someone who doesn't beg for engagement. That's why they called you distant. But you were never detached. You were just unavailable for anything shallow. They couldn't handle the weight of your presence, so they named it awkwardness. They couldn't follow your logic, so they called it overthinking. They couldn't match your emotional bandwidth, so they said you were too sensitive. But now the world is shifting, and suddenly, your traits are currency. Your weirdness, a weapon. Your inner world, a kingdom. Let them knock on doors they once mocked. Let them crave the presence they once overlooked. You weren't designed for applause. You were forged for alignment. And because of that, you've always been difficult to categorize. They couldn't digest the way you carried contradictions, how you could be quiet but powerful, kind but unshakable, observant yet unreadable. You weren't created to fit in. You were born to disrupt patterns. They noticed the friction your presence caused, and instead of exploring it, they labeled it. Easier to laugh at what confuses them than to admit their structure can't contain you, but deep down they know. You didn't fold to their projections, you held your shape, held your voice, held your truth. And that unsettled them in ways they still can't articulate. They felt something off when you entered the room, not because your energy was wrong, but because it was real. Realness rattles the fabricated. Authenticity strips away their performance. You didn't play the social games. You didn't signal the right cues. You refused to bend to expectations designed by people who never questioned why they existed in the first place. And because of that, you stood out, not loudly, not obnoxiously, but unavoidably, like a glitch in their illusion. A reminder that not everyone is wired for conformity. You became the truth they tried to suppress, and truth never blends in. You don't seek chaos, you're just not afraid of it. You walk through tension like it's your natural habitat. While they avoid conflict to maintain fake peace, you sit in discomfort to excavate clarity. That makes you dangerous, because most people will betray themselves to avoid tension. You confront it to understand yourself deeper. That self-ownership, so rare, so pure, it terrifies people who rely on external mirrors to see who they are. You don't need their reflection. You're not a projection. You are a prism. And prisms don't bend light to fit in. They refract it, split it wide open, and show every hidden color the world has never learned how to name. They misunderstood your silence, assumed you had nothing to say. But silence wasn't your emptiness, it was your perimeter, a boundary drawn with elegance. You only speak when the words carry weight. You only act when the motion is rooted in meaning. And people who thrive on constant noise can't comprehend those who wait for depth. They called you boring, aloof, mysterious. But what they meant was, you're not performing for me, and that makes me uncomfortable. Your refusal to broadcast your soul is your sovereignty. Let them choke on the absence they mistook for absence of power. That silence, it echoes. You've been called intense more times than you can count, but that intensity, that's just presence. Full presence. Not filtered, not fragmented. You don't dilute your attention, you lock in. You see people in ways they don't see themselves, and when they realize you're not just listening to respond, but watching to understand, they flinch. Because you reflect back to them the parts they've buried, and instead of owning it, they blame you. Call you invasive, call you weird, but they don't know you've already made peace with their fear. You see it, you name it, you move through it. That's why you grow in silence while they spiral in noise. You weren't trying to be cool, you were trying to heal. You weren't trying to trend, you were trying to breathe. While they layered mask on top of mask, you peeled back the layers. You questioned everything, and they told you to stop overthinking. But thinking deeply in a shallow world is an act of war. You've declared war on mediocrity, on performative living, on diluted identity. That's why they stare. That's why they whisper. You are a disruption. Not loud, but seismic. You cause cracks in foundations that were never sound to begin with, and your existence alone proves there's a different way to live. with depth, with force, with clarity. Your dreams scare them, not because they're unrealistic, but because they require authenticity. Your vision demands self-honesty. It doesn't have room for fakes. And that level of requirement offends people who expect praise for participation. You set standards in silence. You hold yourself accountable in private, and when the results show, they call it luck. They call it obsession, but they don't see the nights you sat alone with your doubt and wrestled it into discipline. They don't see how many times you broke and built again. You weren't chasing success, you were chasing wholeness. And that's why your wins look effortless. Because the effort was never meant to be seen. They called your questions strange. But strange questions birth extraordinary answers. You weren't interested in what already existed. You wanted to build what hadn't been imagined yet. You look at systems and see gaps. You look at traditions and see the cracks. You challenge what's accepted. That doesn't make you weird. That makes you a visionary. But visionaries are always strange until the world finally sees what they were pointing to, and by then, the visionary has already evolved. You're not waiting for applause. You're already sketching the next disruption. You never needed to prove yourself to people addicted to misunderstanding. You outgrew the need for constant explanation. You let them judge. You let them mislabel. And through it all, you remained. You sharpened in silence, transformed in darkness, built frameworks in exile. You aren't the outcast. They are. Outcast from truth, outcast from depth, outcast from the version of themselves they fear to face. And your presence is the confrontation they've avoided their whole life. That's not weird. That's revolutionary. And revolutions never feel safe to the ones guarding the illusion. You're not weird. You're undeniably different, and different changes everything. You don't chase belonging, you embody it. You don't ask to be seen, you see yourself. You don't react, you respond, with clarity, with power, with insight most haven't even begun to unlock. Let them scoff, let them dismiss. You'll keep building in silence, and one day, they'll find themselves studying the same blueprints they once mocked. But by then, you'll be gone. On to the next frontier, the next dimension of self, the next layer of remarkable they'll never be able to touch. You're the moment they'll never admit changed them. Not loudly, not obviously, but something in them bent the day they encountered you. Because deep down, even in their mockery, even in their confusion, they felt it. That pull, that weight, that strange gravitational pressure of someone who doesn't just exist. They disrupt the room by existing. You didn't try to convert anyone. You weren't out to be admired. You weren't preaching. You were simply being. And that being, so unfiltered, so unaffected, so unnervingly self-aware, acted like a mirror they didn't ask for.